What's up everyone, Michael here with a Stable Diffusion video. Today we're going to be talking about Automatic1111 WebUI and how it interacts with Stable Diffusion and how to use it. This is going to act as a general guide and discussion video covering pretty much as possible. It's going to be fairly basic in terms of all of what we cover, but we're going to be covering a lot. So this video is going to be long and there's going to be a lot of information. So if you don't end up catching up on everything, don't worry about it too much. You will be able to cover that more in depth in the future and just kind of take things one step at a time. But this video is going to be all encompassing, or at least try to be, where we're going to try and cover as much as possible so that you understand exactly what Stable Diffusion is, how it works with the WebUI, and how to generate images. So first we're going to start off with installation just in case people don't already have it installed. And we're going to talk about some caveats with that. And then we're going to end up talking about some recommended settings and some stuff about deterministic results that I would like to cover, just so you're already set up. Then we're going to talk about acquiring different models such as checkpoints, LoRa's, VAEs, and the different types of file types. And this will get you done with the basics. And so that will be enough for you to understand the type of resources that you'll need to actually run Stable Diffusion and end up getting started. And then we'll talk about the WebUI. So we're going to cover all of the you see here. And don't worry, if you already have Automatic installed and yours doesn't look like this, don't worry about it. By the end of this video, you'll know how to get set up just like this one. So yeah, let's go ahead and get straight into it. So first off, the one thing that I do want to mention is that Stable Diffusion has a lot of complex elements. And in this video, we're not going to be able to go super in depth. And if you would like to see that type of stuff, do make sure to leave a comment below or check us out over on Discord and make sure to ask questions and stuff. And then I'll know what to put in videos and stuff because there's a lot here. So if there's anything in this video you're ever confused about, you can always ask the community and we'll be able to help you out. And there's a bunch of different AI communities out there that have a lot of really helpful people. So just wanted to mention that real quick, just in case you're watching this video and you get confused by something. So let's begin with installation. This is where a lot of people end up getting a little bit hung up when they're not very tech savvy for the most part, especially if you've never used things like Python and such. But there's no actual programming required in setting up Automatic's WebUI or in using Stable Diffusion in this way. So first off, what we're going to do is we're going to follow the best installation guide, which is actually available over on the Automatic GitHub page. Over here, you'll actually be able to see all of the source code and all that such things. I'm already botching my words. I apologize for that. But you'll be able to actually see all the source code and stuff like that. So if you ever want to dig into it, you possibly can. But they have the best installation guide because it's actually really simple and setting up the UI is pretty easy. So we're just going to scroll down on the page here until we see installation and running. Now they have some more in-depth guides here at the top where it talks about Nvidia, AMD, Intel CPUs and GPUs, and then down at the bottom, down here, it should say Apple Silicon somewhere. There it is. Installation on Apple Silicon. So there are some differences between different GPUs because Stable Diffusion uses GPUs to end up rendering the image. And we won't get too much in depth into that in this video, but it is important to note because there are different dependencies depending on which GPU you have and how many resources you have. We will talk about that a little bit more when we get into the settings aspect. But for setting up, I'm going to be talking about setting up a Nvidia install on Windows 10 or Windows 11. However, the AMD install is exactly the same. So if you follow this AMD link here, it's the same exact steps. However, you're going to want to use this console command instead of the one we'll use for the Nvidia one. And I'll mention that when we get to it. But the installation guide is actually quite simple. They do have an automatic setup guide here if you wanted to follow that one that'll download all the dependencies, but we're going to cover the automatic install on Windows. So first things first, you're going to want to install Python 3.10.6 for this version. We are using the 1.6 version of the WebUI. However, this dependency may change in the future, so do make sure to check the GitHub page, but it should be this link right here on the GitHub page should always link to the correct one. So just follow this link and it'll have an installer. Python is just the programming language, so this is an API slash redistributable package that allows programs to use Python on your computer. The only thing to note about here is that although you can go through the entire installation process and just use defaults throughout, especially if you don't understand anything, just use the default and it'll be fine. But make sure that when it says add Python to path, make sure that box is checked so that it adds Python to path, which basically allows anything on your system to call Python within its own environment, which allows you to actually use Automatic and put it anywhere on your computer and run it from any folder, which is really helpful. And it also avoids a lot of the technical details that you would have to have otherwise. So it's really good to have. Then you're going to need to install Git, which is a program that allows you to pull data from different repos, such as GitHub is this one. And so Automatic uses it to pull updates, pull information, pull extensions, and so on and so forth. Now, after you do the initial setup, The WebUI can be run completely offline, so you only technically need Git at the beginning, but there's no reason to uninstall it. It's a really useful program, and you'll be using it to auto-update Stable Diffusion in the future, gather extensions, and update stuff. So it's really important to have. But step 3 is where we're actually going to get a little bit more in depth and actually cover some stuff in more of a guide type sense. It says download the Stable Diffusion WebUI repository, for example, by running the git clone and then the link to the repository.git. And this part confuses a few people. Basically what it's telling you to do is go to the folder where you want it to install, open a command window, enter in this command, and then install it through that way. So basically it's pretty simple, but we're going to go ahead and cover it here because not everyone's used the command line, and there's some cool tricks that I can show you real quick. So if we go over to my automatic install, you can see these are the files that we're going to be installing using this git pull, and everything is open source as well. It's the same exact files that you would end up seeing at the top of this page here. So it's all of these files as well. So we're just basically going to be downloading all of those files if you're curious, but navigate to wherever on your computer you want to install the WebUI. This can be anywhere, but try and make sure it's somewhere that doesn't require admin privileges, because on some setups, depending on the way you have administration rights set up, it can cause some issues. So I recommend like the documents folder or a separate hard drive or something along those lines if you have one available. And so anyway, so we got an SS or a SATA SSD here that I use for Stable Diffusion. And we're going to go ahead and add a new folder, call it something descriptive so you know what it is. So I'm going to call it the Auto WebUI, and we'll just hit enter there. And now that we have our folder and we want to install it inside this folder, we're just going to go to the folder right here, and we're going to hold the left shift and right click if you're on Windows 10 and go to open PowerShell window here. Or if you're on an older version of Windows 10, it should be open CMD window here. And that will actually open up a little window. But on Windows 11, you can actually just left click it, and it may actually say just open in terminal. So what this is going to do is it's going to open either a command window or it's going to open PowerShell, and it's going to automatically put us where we need to be inside this folder. So we don't have to manually navigate to it, which is super useful if you don't actually know how to navigate through PowerShell. So now that we have that grabbed, we're going to go back to our web page here. And we probably could have copied this beforehand, but we're going to copy this command they told us to get. So the git clone and then the web address, we're going to go ahead and copy that. Make sure not to grab anything extra, like extra spaces before and after or the period at the end. We just want the link along with git and clone at the start. So we're going to do that. And then we're going to go over to PowerShell. On Windows 11, you can just right click, or on Windows 10 or Windows 11, you can hold Control and then press V, and it'll paste it in there. And then we'll go ahead and hit enter. And now what it's going to do is it's going to go ahead and download the resources, and it's going to put everything that was on the GitHub straight into our folder there. So we can go ahead and close this. We don't need it anymore. Go back over to our web install. We're going to go to Auto WebUI like we called it before. It's going to have a Stable Diffusion WebUI folder here. We can double click on that, and then we're inside the folder. Now, if we look back at the instructions, the last instruction it has is run webuser.bat from the Windows Explorer as usual, not administration user. Basically, all that's saying is go to the webuser.bat here, and you'll just double click it and it'll start running, and it'll start updating automatically and downloading all the requirements. Now it's going to take a little bit and it's going to seem kind of confusing, but it will just do it very, very quickly, and you'll be able to see the progress within the command window. But give it a good 15 to 20 minutes when you think it's stuck, just in case your download speed might not be up to snuff. It'll have to download a lot of files and such and do a lot of driver type nonsense with whatever graphics card you're using. Now, like I said, with AMD, you do have to use a different command. So how we did the git clone here, I probably should have mentioned this beforehand, but you'll want to actually use the one for AMD, which is git clone, and then you want to use the DirectML link that is right here. And then they have another additional thing here, which you probably don't need. Howdy there, it's Editor Michael again. So I botched the AMD mention in this video, and so I'm doing a bit of a quick post edit thing. I'm just going to throw up some screenshots where basically, when you install an AMD, you actually just want to open the command terminal or PowerShell from, say, the Windows bar or start menu or whatever. Just use the search bar and type in PowerShell, and it'll pop right up. Go ahead and open that, and then run the entirety of the AMD command here. And so basically, you want to run that. It'll go into the program files inside of your system. And I don't know exactly where it installs because I don't have an AMD system, and so I'm not installing it and such, but it should go to the program files, and then you can just open it and use it from there, or you can just move the folder wherever you want. Now, the reason you have to do it that way is because this command here actually runs some updates for the submodules, and that needs to run in order for it to grab the appropriate drivers and set things up for the AMD branch. So if you're using an AMD GPU, you do need to do it that way for the current guide that they have. Now, in the future, that could change, so make sure to check their AMD guide. I unfortunately don't have an AMD system, and so I can't speak to how it works and stuff like that. So if you struggle with that a little bit, make sure to ask like some AI communities and stuff like that for help, because otherwise I unfortunately can't really cover that. So hopefully that's not too confusing. Hopefully that makes sense. Anyways, back to the video. Just ignore everything I say about AMD here. I apologize. Stable Diffusion WebUI Direct ML. This is a separate branch of Stable Diffusion's WebUI for Automatic, and it supports AMD's Direct ML instead of the CUDA cores that Nvidia uses. If you are using another type of graphics card, I unfortunately don't know a whole lot about the Intel CPU and GPU setups or the Apple Silicon, so you'll have to follow their guides on here, but they are quite extensive. If you go ahead and click on these links here, you can see it'll guide you through everything that you need to do. For macOS specifically, there are some rights management type stuff you'll need to do, so keep that in mind. But if you're on Windows, super simple. Same thing on Linux, super simple. And basically, now that we have this window, or this, sorry, not window, now that we have this folder, we can just move it wherever we want on Windows and run WebUI from that folder. It runs inside its own contained environment, so as long as this folder stays intact, you can even rename it or whatever. As long as all the files inside here remain intact, it'll run perfectly fine. Now, I already have a Stable Diffusion setup, and it takes quite a while to do the initial setup, like I was saying, like 15 to 20 minutes, and we ain't got time for that. So instead of going through and actually doing the whole setup process on a clean installation, I'm gonna go ahead and close my Automatic that's open right now, and we're going to reset the config, and then we're going to go through a couple of options that I like to change in order to set it up in the way that I would like to do so. So let's go ahead and find the config file in here. So if you want to ever manually edit things, you can. All these files are openable. So for example, on the webuser.bat, if you right click it, and you can go ahead and, go to more information, and you should be able to click edit, and that'll open it up into a notepad file. So as we see here, we have our notepad file. This allows us to put in command lines, redirects for Python, Git, our VNV directory, which is like a cache folder, temporary directories, so on and so forth. Now, one line that I'm gonna recommend putting in here is called the auto launch. So I believe it's auto launch. Let me actually double check that because I have my customized one. So we'll go ahead and open up my customized one as well. You can also copy this folder and run it from within this folder wherever you want. So you don't have to run it exactly like that. Oh, it has no dash in the middle. There we go. So auto launch is really useful. What auto launch will do is when you click on the webuser.bat, it'll automatically open it up. So after you've done that initial setup of opening the webuser.bat, you'll just close the command window after it's done setting it up and then enter in this command, hit Control and S to save the file, and then when you double click the webuser.bat, it'll automatically open your web browser with the WebUI, which is super nice to have. Another command I like to have is called update check, as you can see down in my bottom one. And update check basically just does a quick update check. Some people like to do auto update, which also is quite useful. Basically, it updates if there's another update to the main branch, but I don't like doing that because sometimes updates to the main branch will end up causing issues or have bugs. And so to avoid that, I just do an update check. That way I can know when there is an update, but I don't have to force myself to update. And the last two commands we're going to cover here is going to be low VRAM and medium VRAM. Now, even though I have a good graphics card with a lot of VRAM, I do use mid VRAM on SDXL. Now, this is a specific command when you're using an SDXL model, which we'll talk about a little bit later. It makes it so it uses the mid VRAM command, which basically is a memory saving tool that makes generations take longer, but saves you a lot of memory. Now, I like to generate large images, and so this is helpful for SDXL. However, if you're on a lower end graphics card with less VRAM, or even like a mid-range graphics card or a high-end graphics card with less VRAM, say less than 8 gigabytes of VRAM, then even running on SD 1.5 models, which uses a lot less memory than SDXL, can actually run out of memory, and then you can't generate images. So to actually fix that, if you're on a lower end graphics card with less memory, you can either do low VRAM, which will slow down things a lot, or you can do mid VRAM and try that out. I recommend only doing mid VRAM if you possibly can. Try it out without these two commands first, but you can always come back in here and add these commands later. There's also optimization options within the WebUI, but it's easier to do it in this command line argument. So there you go. But even on my RTX 4090, this is the commands that I normally use. The last one that you see here is just a redirect to an extra folder that can load checkpoints I use for like merging models and such like that. So we won't cover that in this video. But there you go. And then again, once you're done, go ahead and hold Control and S or go up to File and Save. And then this will save it so that when you launch the WebUI, it will be launching. And the next thing we're going to look at is the config.json file. I am just going to take mine. I'm going to make a copy of it. And I am going to make a .bat because I already have a backup of my older file. So there we go. And we're just going to delete that file. And then we're going to double click on the webuser.bat and we're going to go ahead and open it. Now you don't have to do the config thing. I'm just going to open up a window here. We'll be looking at that model later for use. There we go. So I reset my config so it should look exactly like yours will when you end up first launching it. So here we go. We got the blue UI. There we go. So now I'm back to what it normally looks like. I'll just do a quick comparison on what we're going to set up and what it initially looks like, which there's only a couple of changes. Like at the top bar, we're going to add those quick list things. We're going to change the color of it and the theme to something that we like. And then we're also going to change the defaults, which for some reason it saved the defaults. So I guess the defaults are saved in another file I was unaware of. So that I didn't know. I apologize for that. But generally speaking, these the prompt spaces will be empty and set up differently. If I go ahead and click these back to where they would be by default real quick, just to try and make this thing easy for everyone to understand. So typically speaking, I believe your UI should look like this. Except for the model up in the top left, you won't have the Abyss linked in there because you won't have any models there. But when Stable Diffusion launches, it will actually load up a default model, the one released by Stable Diffusion, or Stable AI, sorry. And it will be the base SD 1.5 model. It's okay. You can use it. It's good for like getting used to things and like trying to test it out, but its quality isn't very good. So the first thing we're going to cover is we're going to go over some settings within the WebUI to try and set us up for deterministic results, get some convenience type stuff set up, and then I'm going to relaunch my WebUI, go back into my defaults just because I have some custom stuff set up. And then we're going to go and acquire models, talk about installing them, and then we're going to go over the WebUI and how to actually use it, as well as some extensions. So let's go ahead and start off with our settings. So let's go ahead and go over to the settings tab here. Apologies if I'm going too quick, by the way. You can always rewind or slow down the video or something like that. And the first thing we're going to cover here is actually the saving images and grids option here. So you've got a couple of buttons here. Don't get too worried about there being too much text here. And we're going to go ahead and slim down our window so you can see all the settings in one little convenient spot here so you don't have to look across the screen. So up at the top, we got apply settings and reload UI. So anytime we change any settings, we do have to click apply settings. Every time I do a settings reset or any update, I always go to apply settings up at the top, and you'll see it clicked a bunch of stuff and it automatically set that up there. What that does is it automatically puts everything that has not been configured already to defaults within the config file. And this means that it will keep those settings even between updates. That way, if you update the WebUI, you don't get surprised by some setting that randomly changed and your WebUI is suddenly broken in some way that you think like you don't understand or whatever. So that's a nice little trick to do. So after every single update, I always do that just to make sure it sets some defaults so it doesn't randomly change between updates, which is quite nice. I'm gonna go ahead and click onto another tab and then click back. Oh, it just stayed there. Oh man, that's going to be annoying. Let's go ahead and click reload UI so that it'll reset the UI and reset our settings menu, because having that large bit of text there is going to be a little bit annoying. That must be a bug in the current version because normally it didn't do that. I apologize for that. All right, so let's go ahead and start off with what we're going to end up doing first. Most of these settings I'm going to recommend keeping on default, but over here in the saving images, we want to enable the saving before the face restoration and settings such as that. So if we scroll down here, we say save a copy of image before doing face restoration, before applying high res fix. You can enable this if you want. I typically don't, but I do when I'm testing. So you can play around with this. But basically what these settings do, like save copy image before applying image correction, what these three settings will do is it'll create a copy of the image that you're generating before it does these extra processes. So face restoration, high res fix, and color correction are post processes that will run after the image is already generated. So doing these settings will make it so that you already have a reference, because sometimes when you do face restoration or high res fix or something like that, it might destroy the image or change it in a way that you're not certain about. So having these enabled will allow you to look back at how that generation went and be able to customize it later. This will make more sense once we actually get into using the WebUI. Next, we're going to go down to the lossless compression. So over here, we have use lossless compression for WebP images. I recommend enabling this one. And I also recommend disabling the save a copy of a large images as JPEG, just because this takes up a lot of extra space because it'll generate extra images. Generally speaking, when you go through these settings, I try not to have extra stuff saved. I also end up disabling the grid saving system as well, but we won't cover that in this video because it's not necessarily something that most people end up doing. And that should cover it for this page. Another thing that I would like to do is the directory for temporary images, actually, down at the bottom. If you're running Stable Diffusion off an SSD like I do, setting up a temporary directory on like a hard drive or something along those lines is typically a good idea, so you don't end up burning out your SSD by like writing a bunch of image files to it all the time. So I use an extra hard drive. So if we go over to my browser here, I have a hard drive E, and if I go to here, I have one called AI tooling, and I have an output folder. And so I'll end up saving things to here. And so I have a temp folder here that will save all of the temporary files. And Automatic WebUI and Stable Diffusion in general creates a lot of temporary files. So this can help save your SSD's lifespan quite a bit. So that is quite important. You just copy the path there. So for example, if I go back to my E drive, I go to AI tooling, and I go to my output, I can just go to this top bar here, right click, copy address as text, go back in here, Control V, paste it in there, or right click and paste, and it'll end up going there. And then all the temporary files will go into there. Now, technically I would do the temporary folder, but you get the point. You just copy the folder where you want it to go, and then it'll go in there. I recommend saving the temporary folder as in a separate folder than the image generation folder, which we'll talk about right now, actually. So if we go to the left side on the next path, it says paths for saving. So when you click on here, it says directory for images. This is, again, if you're running on an SSD, you can end up having it go to a hard drive instead. So if we go back to my output folder here, I have one for grids, I have one for images, I have one for logs, and I have one for temporary folders, and you can just copy those. So if we go into images, for example, here's that one image that I had here. And so anytime I generate an image, the final image will be pasted into this folder. So yeah, it's quite nice to have it so you can set it wherever you want. And I recommend, if you're on an SSD, like I said, set it on a hard drive if you have one. If you don't, just kind of deal with it, I guess, and try to limit how many images you're generating in unnecessary quantities, such as disabling grids and such. Anyways, so there you go. You could set those individually. Now, I've noticed some extensions will actually just use the output directory for like the specific ones. So if you do create one default directory and you want it to be for all of them, do copy that into each of these. So for example, if I wanted to do it for images, I would copy it into all of these, and then that would cover all of the images to input into the same folder. Otherwise, some extensions will use the wrong folder, and that can be kind of confusing when you're first using extensions. I know, for example, the supermerger extension that I use saves it into the default directory for text to image for whatever reason, and it ignores the defaults, which is annoying. So if you have this empty, it'll save it in the outputs folder inside Stable Diffusion. Just to quickly cover that as well, if we go back to my WebUI in Automatic, if you go to your Automatic install here, the output will actually by default go to a folder called outputs right here. And if you click on this, you'll see all these folders pre-made. And then if you go to images, they will paste into here from your text to image or, text to grid or whatever you end up doing. So just to cover that real quick. Anyways, let's actually get back to the rest of the settings we want to cover. Next, we want to go to the API. This is more of a sanity check. So there's a lot of dubious guides out there that tell you to enable a bunch of different settings or have like setup scripts. In here, make sure that forbid URLs to local resources is enabled. So basically what this does is it means that, say, a URL that is put into, say, a malicious checkpoint or malicious code that somebody had ran on your Automatic WebUI, you might have other problems, but this basically prevents Automatic from changing local resources, such as, say, System32, and like just crashing your system, because that would be unfortunate. We don't want that to happen. Yeah, and I just have that as a sanity check in here. Then we go over to Stable Diffusion. This is when we talk about the sort of setup for deterministic results. Now, not everyone cares about deterministic results, but as we'll get into a little bit later, deterministic results are very useful and really important for actually generating high quality images and experimentation. Not everyone cares, but let's go ahead and set this up so that, we'll just go top to bottom so that we can get deterministic results. Starting off with the number one, doesn't matter. Most of these don't really matter, so we're actually going to skip over this one. This is just how many checkpoints are loaded at one time. Keep one model on the device, checkpoints are cached. UNet, go ahead and leave this on automatic. That way it'll use whatever the model is designed to use. This means that other people that are using the model will have the same results as you, or you'll have the same results as them. If you set it to none, then it will try to use whatever you did from the checkpoint. But you can also use, for example, if you leave it on automatic, it will use use one with same file name as checkpoint. That's worded a little bit strangely. But what Automatic will allow you to do is you can set a UNet model next to the checkpoint, and some models will actually have a UNet model next to them. So this is why we end up keeping it up on default. Now you could just set it to none and use whatever is default for the model, but using Automatic is probably the way that you want to use it, just to keep setup more consistent between different models. Enable quantization in K-sampler. We're going to keep this disabled. This will change the existing seed, so anybody else who doesn't have this enabled will have a different generation, and it's not necessary, so we're going to ignore that. Enable emphasis, which is just a UI thing. Make K-diffusion samplers produce same images in a batch as when making a single image. This is very important to have enabled. So basically, when you're using K-diffusion samplers, it could carry over the sampling rate between different generations. We'll slightly cover what that means later, but not too much in this video. But that's important because if somebody else is doing batches and you're doing single images, you want to be able to reproduce that. And it'll say it in the metadata as well, so you can end up generating whatever you need. Oh, by the way, enable emphasis is a UI thing, but it does check, or it does make results deterministic in the sense that if somebody else is using that in their prompt, you'll want this enabled so that you can copy it in your prompt. All right, anyways, prop word wrap length limit, we're going to keep this on default, which should be 20. And then the clip skip, we're going to leave this default to 1, but we're actually going to add it up to the top bar so we can customize it. So generally speaking, for a lot of models on SD 1.5, especially for newer models, they're trained on clip skip 2, but it'll depend on which model you're using. And it'll say in the description which clip skip you're supposed to use, but you can also experiment with it. We're not going to cover too much of like what clip skip is in this video. Upcast cross attention layer to float 32. We're going to leave this disabled, but if you're using a graphics card that doesn't support float 16, this is a nice option to have enabled. However, I'm not certain whether it changes the seed results or not. It doesn't state it does, and it shouldn't, but I'm not certain. So I generally leave this unticked. Obviously, I have a graphics card that supports float 16, so we don't have to worry about this. But yeah, that gets into technical details we won't be covering in this video, but just keep that in mind that if your images aren't generating or you get some sort of error, it might tell you to turn on upcast cross attention layer to float 32. And if you do so, it shouldn't change results, but it is going to be slower. So there you go. This one's really important. Random number generator resource. This is going to be set to CPU instead of GPU. Basically, what this means is that it's going to generate a seed to generate noise for Stable Diffusion to interpret into an image. We won't cover that in this video. But if you run it on GPU, then it's going to be specific to your GPU and driver version, which means that if you update your driver or you update your system or you change to a different computer or somebody else on a different computer tries to run it, it will generate a different image if they're not running the same driver version and the same GPU. So we actually set it to CPU. That way, we can ensure that even if our system updates or a driver changes, we can always generate the same exact image each time because it's using the CPU, which is deterministic. Deterministic meaning it'll be the same every time, which means that we can generate the same image if we need to, which is good. Tiling, this is optimization type stuff. We're going to leave it disabled because it does change result quality. It doesn't necessarily change results in its own right, but it can change the quality. And then high-res fix, we're going to leave it on second pass. This is what most people do, and it's pretty much the best way to do it, but you can change it to first pass if you want like legacy support type results, which gets into technical stuff we're not going to cover here. Anyways, next we're going to look at Stable Diffusion. Just leave all this at default, but one thing I did want to mention is that there is a low aesthetic score and a high aesthetic score, which if you're playing around with SDXL and you get more into the technical details, you might want to customize these, but generally speaking, you want to leave them on default as most people do because you'll get the same results as them, you know, deterministic and whatnot like that. Next, for a VAE, just go ahead and leave these bottom two on full. Some guides and such will tell you to put it on TAESD for whatever reason, and then people will get errors and they're confused why. Just use full. I don't know why people recommend that, but I've seen it a couple of times, so make sure that that is there. And they explain what a VAE is up here as well. Next, we're going to go over to optimizations. This is where the next important bit of our deterministic results ends up coming into play. Up here on the cross-attention optimization, so there are various different ways to optimize it, including Xformers, which won't be listed here because you have to install those separately and run them in the command line. But any type of optimization that affects memory handling will cause some sort of non-deterministic result. And the reason why is really complicated. We won't cover in this video. But basically what I recommend here is the SDP no mem scaled dot production without memory efficient attention. And what this does is it basically runs memory or runs no mem optimizations on the SDP or scaled dot production, which will speed up your generation, but it won't affect the memory aspects of the generation. I think it saves a little bit of VRAM, but not a whole lot. So if you are on a memory limited system, you might need to use, say, Xformers, which we won't cover in this video, or SDP scaled dot production, which will affect your deterministic results and change your results. So keep that in mind. But generally speaking, I recommend SDP no mem. It makes it a lot faster, it makes it a lot easier to generate, and it works pretty well. However, in the future, there may be other cross-attention optimizations that we might recommend. So make sure to, if we're, 5 months from now, make sure to talk to people and figure out what the best optimization is. But at the time of recording, SDP no mem, it seems to be a pretty safe bet. But if you're running out of memory and stuff like that, you can try the other ones, should you please to do so. The only other one on here is the ensure the bad prompt and negative prompt is disabled over here. So padding the prompt and negative prompt to the same length. This is just a performance optimization, but it does change the results. So you don't necessarily want to enable it because most people are not going to change this from default. But if you are having problems with performance or you want it to generate faster, you can try this. Just know that it'll change the results that you get. So if you try to generate an image with or without this option, they will be different depending on the setting that you have enabled. So keep that in mind. Next, we're just going to quickly talk about the extra networks real quick. We're not going to be covering these too much, but the one thing I did want to mention is the show hidden file directories. So basically, if you add a period to the beginning of any folder inside Windows or Linux, I believe, it will hide the folder from programs, or by default anyways, and it hides it in the file browser, but you can actually enable it so you can see these. This is just really helpful to have enabled just because you can use it for organization and sorting files and stuff. So it's really nice, but some automatic setups will actually disable this option, or it might be disabled on older versions of the WebUI. So if you're updating the WebUI, you might run into some issues here. And then over on the user interface, this is where we're going to add that top bar over to our screen. So down here, if we scroll down, we actually see the quick list setting. This is really important in my opinion. So if you click on here, you got a bunch of different stuff, and anything that you add will actually add it to the top bar up at the top. So if we go back and look at the way my WebUI was set up, I had the VAE, I had the clip skip, and I had ETA noise. We won't be covering what most of those are, but we will be covering the VAE. So let's go ahead and add in SD VAE here. So you'll find it on the list. You can just type in to end up, have it eliminate your results. So you can just type it in and hit enter, or you can go and find it. Oh, sorry, you can't hit enter because it selects whatever's selected. That's a new feature. I haven't noticed that. VAE, and then we'll go ahead and click the SD_VAE. So we'll click that. And then we're going to go ahead and add in clip. I'll go ahead and show up like on screen what I already had here in my settings just to make it easier for us. But clip stop at last layers. And then we're also going to add the ETA noise. So the ETA noise seed delta. And basically, once you have that set up, you'll have to apply it and then reload our WebUI, and it should show up at the top. Go ahead and load this in. There we go. And now you can see we have it up at our top bar. The last two things we're going to cover real quick is two optimization settings. I like to have it like that, but we're just going to keep it small like that. There we go. All right, so if we go ahead and go on here and we go back to our user interface, now you notice how mine was different colors. That's just a Gradio theme. So if we go to the second option over here, it's currently default, but we can set it to whatever we want. It will require resetting. I don't remember which one I have set. So in the video editing process, I'll go ahead and show up whichever one I had enabled. But yeah, so you can go ahead and select these and they will change it. You just apply it, go ahead and reload the WebUI, and then it will change the way that the WebUI looks. And then we're going to go into the info text setting as well. So we go over to settings, go down to info text, which should be right here underneath the web user or the user interface. And generally, I prefer to have all of these enabled except for the add username to generation information when authenticated. This is by default. You pretty much want these enabled, and this allows you to actually load up the image that you generate into the WebUI and get the parameters that it used. So it basically bakes the information that was used to generate the image into the image itself inside the metadata, and allows you to pull that data from wherever you want or wherever you source the image. So you can also share your prompts with other people by just sharing the image that you had generated and be like, hey, I generated this image. Can you try it on your machine? Or maybe like they're asking for prompt help. You could just like make an image and then send it to them, and then they can load it in their WebUI, load up the results. And it's super awesome. That is currently in the PNG info. So if we go back to my images, oops, wrong button. Oh, I accidentally closed it. So let's go ahead and open my images folder here. So if we go back to my images here, we go to images, and we just go to PNG info tab here. We click our image, just drag it into there, or you can click it and upload it that way. And you can see it shows all of the parameters that were used to generate it. And then we can say send to text to image, and that will actually just send it over here. And then if we generate it, it should apply it as we had seen. Oh, it actually generated something else because I have the wrong checkpoint selected. So we do have to have the right checkpoint selected. There is an option to make it switch the checkpoint, but you don't have to do that. I don't. But that's what it would look like on AOM3, I guess. But yeah, so there we go. And it gave us the same exact image that we had before. So there we go. So that's how you can set up deterministic results, get it from a PNG file that somebody else had generated or any other type of file or whatever, or you can just take up the generation data that they post, say online or whatever, and then throw it into your WebUI, and you should get the same results as long as their results are also deterministic. Now, one thing to note before we move on is that a lot of this stuff will change depending on the user. There's a lot of things that you can customize and change that change the way things generate, and you won't necessarily have access to all of that. And this also includes things like extensions, which we won't be talking about too much here, but you will see that there are various extensions that you can enable and install, and these will change the results drastically depending on what they are. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get some water so that I can have some nice breath for the next bit of this, but we're going to talk about next acquiring models, how to install models, how to use them, and then how to use the WebUI as well, and then do a short explainer on extensions and such like that. So I will be right back. Let's go ahead and take a hydration break. Final edit from editor Michael here. So we forgot to add in the default option. So in the settings panel at the very bottom, there's an option called defaults. You just click on that, and then you can view the changes that are going to happen, and then you can just hit apply, and it applies the changes that you have in the text to image or image to image or any of the other panels, and it will just save a default configuration that you have currently set, which is quite nice to use and is actually super awesome. And also, because I originally recorded this video as a single long part, I didn't record an outro. Actually, I didn't even record an outro for the last video either, like the vast fourth part of it or whatever. So thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you want to see more content like this, definitely let me know. There are definitely 3 more parts to this as well, and it has a lot of useful information. I apologize if you watch through this expecting it to be literally everything. That is literally impossible, but I hope that this has become very, very useful, and this first part is definitely something that I think a lot of people need to watch, because a lot of these deterministic settings bring up questions from people a lot. There's a lot of people that try to generate images and they don't get the same thing, or something doesn't line up properly, or they complain that they weren't able to generate the same exact image before or whatever. So that's probably the most important part of this entire video, actually. So yeah, thank you guys so much again for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. I almost forgot, Discord, link in the description. Go ahead and check it out. Also, you can donate on Kofi to support my work.